Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you here with our Neuroscience and Education webinar series. Before we get started with our wonderful session about brains in the Common Core, just want to give you a little bit about the logistics. We are recording this session, and it will be available on our website within a week of today. You will get an email that will let you know when it is up and ready for viewing. If you call in, you'll be placed on mute as you enter the room. And what you can do as you have questions throughout is to just type your question into the chat window over to the right or the question and answer area. And we will be taking some of those questions throughout this afternoon's webinar. I'm now going to turn over the floor to the President and COO of Learning Enhancement Corporation, Betsy Hill.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. We're so glad to have everybody joining us today for this, what promises to be a very, very interesting webinar. I have known Margaret Glick for a number of years now, and we met through Pat Wolf, who, as many of you know, is the author of Brain Matters, and sort of a guru and mentor to many people on the application of neuroscience and education. Margaret has taken all of that knowledge and also her years of experience as a teacher, a principal, and a superintendent, and woven that all together actually into a really wonderful book called The Instructional Leader and the Brain. Anybody who is interested in getting a very clear, very solid, basic understanding of the brain and its implications for instructional direction and strategy. I can't recommend the book highly enough. It's just really wonderful. And Margaret is doing a lot of work these days on the Common Core state standards, and we sort of connected these ideas and realized how very vital it is to understand and apply neuroscience as we think about the Common Core standards. So we're really delighted to have her here with us today. We will be, also she has offered to provide a copy of her slides, which we will be sending out some point not too long after today's webinar. So if you don't have to scribble notes madly trying to copy down everything on the slides. So with that in mind, I'm going to just turn it over and introduce Margaret Glick.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. At this point, I believe I'm going to share my desktop with the group, which will allow me to begin my presentation.
If Sarah has not already made you the presenter, then she will.
Oh, okay. My bad.
Do that.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I knew there was something I forgot.
There you go.
Now I am the presenter. All right. Alrighty, so
we can see your screen. That looks great.
Everybody see the screen? Perfect. My presentation today is about the Common Core and cognition, and essentially the instructional shifts and different methods for ways that we can teach and learn that will help us and help our students with the Common Core implementation and application. So the outcomes that I'd like to describe to you today, there are three basic outcomes. The first is just a little revisit about connecting the learning in the brain and how it connects to the Common Core, and then a brief familiarity with the Common Core standards, some things about some kind of boilerplate issues about the Common Core, and then the majority of today will be looking at different methods that support these instructional and cognitive shifts that the Common Core will bring. So with that, we'll get started. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about some things that neuroscience has taught us about learning. The first thing is that learning is a biologically active process. It occurs as a result of experiences and events in our lives. It requires rehearsal processing and practice, and there are different types of learning that may require different types of rehearsal for effective encoding to really build skills and knowledge. Learning is about the development of thinking patterns, and this is something that we'll go into much more depth because this lies at the heart of what we will need to do some shifting of in our classrooms for the Common Core. And finally, it can continue throughout a lifetime. We can learn from the time we are born to the time that we leave. So a little bit about how this happens, a little review for some of you, and for some of you maybe some interesting new things. So it all begins with these wonderful cells, the neurons. These are just different photos of neurons. So we know that these different neurons connect. Dendrites send information, axons collect information, etc. They pass through this beautiful synapse. And it's, as the slide suggests, it's literally about making connections. So learning is a physical act that requires this kind of repetition and rehearsal to make these connections. And these connections create thinking patterns or cognition. And these are a couple images of a different way of thinking about or looking at thinking patterns. They're called tensor diffusion images. And these represent white matter or tracks. So these are different beautiful images of the thinking patterns in our brains. And when I teach adults and students, because I sometimes teach students about their brains, I use an analogy that I'm going to share with you to help guide them in understanding about things like repetition and rehearsal and why they're so important in developing these thinking patterns. So I talk to them about thinking about their first time learning something or first experience with something like walking through a field, a footpath, and how if you never walked through that field again, if you never returned or rehearsed or made meaning of what it was you were learning, the path would go away, would disappear. But with the right kinds of rehearsal and elaboration and meaning and purpose, that footpath becomes a hiking trail, a dirt path, much more visible and probably more readily accessible. And still with more repetition and rehearsal, elaboration, and meaning, use, we go from a hiking trail to a dirt road where we might be able to actually get a vehicle past. So the speed at which we can move through this area could increase. And then finally, with still more repetition and rehearsal, we move to a paved road. And as we become experts in something, as we get better and better from use and from purpose and meaning and application, we go from a paved road to a superhighway. So the difference between a novice or neophyte and an expert is often all about using the information, applying the information, etc. So we want our kids to get some superhighways in their brains, cognitive superhighways. And so in order to develop these, there are things we need to do very deliberately as teachers. And with the Common Core, as we talk about in a moment, there are some ways to help develop these superhighways. So in these different ways that I'm going to share, we help kids develop rich neural networks. So these different methods foster the development of these neural networks, and the methods that I'm sharing with you right now we'll talk about in just a minute. And these methods make learning, help to mediate learning in a very active way. And so with the advent of these Common Core standards, these different methods are going to be particularly helpful for kids and teachers. So let's talk a little bit, a moment, about the Common Core standards. So the words used to describe often are fewer, clearer, higher, and this is due to the fact that these standards were created with the intent to provide all the students, all the children in our country with core important, internationally benchmarked standards and learning criteria that promotes college and career readiness and the 21st century skills and the kinds of things that will help our kids live on a planet they've never experienced before in the future. So I want to give you a few bits of information that may be helpful for those of you who might not be familiar with this. I imagine most of you are very familiar with this website. It's extremely helpful in developing understanding about the details about the Common Core. It's corestandards.org. I highly recommend, if you are unfamiliar with this, that bar at the top gives you more information than you could possibly want. But it's very, very helpful. The other thing that I wanted to mention is the next generation assessments that are attached to the Common Core standards. Now there are two different consortia. There's a Smarter Balanced consortia and PARC. And I'm going to show you very briefly what Smarter Balanced, the website, the name of it, and what it looks like. I just took a screenshot so you would recognize it. It's another website that is extraordinarily helpful and loaded with information. And this is PARC, parkonline.org. Again, very, very informative. So there are some instructional shifts with the Common Core that are coming with the Common Core. And I am not going to go through each and every one of these in detail for you because I know, first of all, many of you are probably familiar with many of these, but also this webinar is being archived, so you could come back to this and you have access to my PowerPoint. Happy to share it. But some big picture instructional shifts that I wanted to describe and explain are in English language arts. There is a focus on a balance of informational text, reading informational text, and reading literature. So right now in many classrooms across the United States, we have a great deal of literature being read, and the Common Core state standards are looking to balance that out with more informational text being not only read but written about. So the other shift in language arts is the reading and writing is grounded in evidence from the text. So things like text-dependent questions, citing evidence in different kinds of text is going to be extremely important, and the ways to do that will be extremely important for teachers. Close reading, you'll hear a lot about close reading strategies, and I'll share one of those with you today. So all of these different things with an emphasis. Hello?
Bless you, somebody sneezed.
Oh, okay.
I don't know where it was, but.
Well, okay, bless you. So with an emphasis on complex text, this idea of complex text with lexile levels or levels of reading that are a bit higher than we already have, and the idea of anchor standards. So this in English language arts, there will be anchor standards, 10 for reading, 10 for writing, 6 for speaking and listening, and 6 for language. So these anchor standards are going to be the same standard that builds in complexity and depth from kindergarten to 12th grade. And the three kinds of writing that English language arts will focus on are argument, narrative, and informational writing. So some math shifts that we'll see, different focuses on foundational and conceptual understanding. So this idea of being able to access mathematical computation quickly and use it and apply it is going to be paramount. Then the idea of coherence, very connected math ideas and major topics. Rigor, the application of math concepts is going to increase pretty dramatically. And then there's something called mathematical practices that are like habits of mind for kids. So things like persevering and accuracy, things that are more habits of mind maybe than specific skills. So the bottom line with this information in Common Core is that these standards and the next generation assessments are going to require our kids and our teachers to work at higher levels of cognition and application than most standards currently require. Most standards meaning throughout the states, the different kinds of standards currently, I would say that the vast majority are at levels that are not quite at the Common Core levels. So I wanted to spend a minute showing you some current standards versus Common Core state standards. So the first, this is a 5th grade, and in my examples for you, I choose some primary, some middle, some elementary standards. So this is a 5th grade English language arts, current English language arts state standard. Discern main ideas, etc. So the comparable standard in the Common Core is this. So determine 2 or more main ideas of text, and explain how they're supported, etc. So when you take a look at this from a cognitive viewpoint, I want to point out just a couple things. One is the words that the descriptors of what students will need to do. So we go from discern, which is somewhat vague, to determine, identify and assess, to explain and summarize. So some things that you see from when you compare this current to the Common Core, a certain level of passive nature to active, and I think even more important for the cognitive development of students is I think that the Common Core standard is easier to give feedback to and for students because of its specificity, and easier probably to write really specific learning targets for students so they can track and know what they're learning and how they're learning it. So here is another example of a 5th grade social studies current standard. Trace the routes. I underlined in red the action that students would be required to do. Now here is the Common Core comparable. So if you take a look at the Common Core, a fairly large difference, I think, in complexity. This again is fairly passive and also does not require the level of blooms that the Common Core does. So when you look at these two and you consider which is more complex, I think that it's fairly obvious that this Common Core, the level of complexity is far outweighs the current. So here's a couple math. Here's a current, this is a released item from a standardized test for a state in math, 4th grade mathematics, basic subtraction and a choice, as opposed to, this is a released item for, this is from Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortia. It's a released item. That it requires a bit more fluid intelligence, and what I mean by that is an ability for a student to think on their feet, to be able to have a certain level of flexibility in thinking, to be able to figure this out, as opposed to find the right letter to circle or the right dot to fill in. So you notice in this item, it also asks students to explain how they solve to this problem. So not only do they need to have this certain amount of flexibility, they need to be able to articulate. And that is a fairly large gap that I see in some classrooms currently. The being able to do the algorithm, complete the problem is one thing, but being able to explain how people solve problems is quite a different thing. So here's another Smarter Balanced, and Park will also have performance tasks that students are required to do. This is something that you can go on their website and find very easily. So this is just a sample. It's very, not only do they contextualize it, but it's very heavy in application. What they ask of students, the 4th graders, this is pages and pages long. But so what I wanted you to be able to see today was the difference, again, between how we currently assess in some states, in most states, mathematical application and what's coming with these next generation assessments. So some things about the Common Core and what they will require cognitively of students. And I would ask if there are any questions at this time. I know I've laid a lot of information on you. Are there any questions at this time? Any burning questions?
Sarah, have you seen anything where people need clarification or want Margaret to explore a little bit more?
I don't see any. I don't see any questions that anybody has posted, but they could be typing right now in a flurry. So,
okay.
So we can come back to that then.
All right. Well, I am happy to answer questions along the way. So these different things that the Common Core will require of our students, and in comparison with current standards in most states, we do have a gap, and we will need to make some shifts. So, and this is one of the reasons why we will need to make some shifts. These are some samples of current methods of instruction that may not be everywhere all the time, but that are still fairly common in classrooms. So one thing that I see on occasion is read a piece of text. Now, when we talk about text with the Common Core, we're going to be talking about complex text, which means there are different qualitative, quantitative measures and matching reader to text that is going to be very important. And this complex text is going to be at higher levels, lexile levels and complexity. So we may see currently a piece of text read that is not necessarily complex, let's put it that way. And as a processing or rehearsal or elaboration to learn this information, sometimes this is what is asked of students. And so when you consider some of the things that we have talked about this afternoon about what the Common Core is going to be requiring, this is not really going to cut it anymore. So the Bloom's level is probably fairly low in this kind of activity. Now, if we look at math, some common practices that are still seen on occasion, students watching the teacher complete a problem on the board, or nowadays sometimes it's a smart board, or sometimes it's a document camera, and then they are asked to complete the procedures for whatever the math is that they are learning. Again, this does not necessarily match what is going to be expected, not only of the next generation assessments, but in life, right? And then finally, at times in social science classrooms and middle school, I may see this being, read the chapter on the Crusades and answer the questions at the end of the chapter. And once again, oftentimes, depending on the questions, generally, the Bloom's level is not incredibly high. So this is the question I would ask, especially of instructional leaders out there and teachers who are thinking about how they might design curriculum and instruction for the Common Core. When you think about what's required outside of the classroom, the thinking skills, I'm not sure we require in our lives people to complete crossword puzzles or algorithms numerous times. So this idea of what is happening in many classrooms currently and the shift required is not only for next generation assessments, it's for life. So now we're getting into the realm of the different kinds of learning, processing, and practice and feedback that the Common Core will require successful implementation and learning with Common Core. So it will require teachers and students to be actively in the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy pretty frequently and pretty consistently in order to apply how they will have to apply with Common Core standards. So I'd like to share with you now at this point 4 different methods that are methods that are examples of some of the mediational kinds of teaching and learning that can be really helpful in ratcheting up levels of cognition and learning. So the 4...
And Margaret, when you think, if I can just sort of interject just for a moment, when you talk about mediated learning and some of the terminology we're just using, could you connect that then to the brain? I mean, is what we're really talking about here the incorporation of our understanding of the way that the brain learns?
Yes, absolutely. So when I use the term mediated learning, what I mean is that when we understand now that the brain is modifiable, we can change our brains in terms of we can learn new things. We can learn, new languages, but also new physical movements, etc. So when I use a term like mediated, what I mean is you may, as a classroom teacher, have students in your classroom right now that are unaware and don't seem to be able to find main ideas in something they read. But that is modifiable. So we can mediate that by doing certain specific things and having students and kids develop the skills needed to find main ideas or many, many different kinds of things, much as, as things like many of you may be customers of Brainware. So those are the kinds of things that help students develop these neural networks that I talked about and become, go from the footpath to the paved road with practice and repetition and purposeful use is very important too. So does that...
Margaret, there's a question that might also feed into this that just came in.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, how does a second grader, for instance, get better at addition if they don't have repetition?
If they don't have repetition?
Yes.
I think repetition is a good thing. You would want to repeat some things as a second grader. Maybe I didn't understand the question. Is that?
Well, for example, when you showed the sort of old instructional strategy, which is watching the teacher do a problem and then repeating it, and I'm not sure that that's exactly what this person had in mind, but if it's not that kind of repetition, then what kind of strategy would you use to help them learn that and be very fluent and facile with it?
Got it. So I'm gonna bump over to this. We were talking about maybe this certainly does.
Yeah, that's probably it.
Yeah, so this might give a lot of repetition, and I'm not saying to never do this, but what I am saying is there is a time for developing this facility with the skill, but you need to balance this with other things, such as, so when we're talking about mediated learning and a second grader learning about addition, the first foray into addition for a second grader, first of all, they've been dealing with addition all their life. They haven't had a label for it, right? So when they take a cookie and they take another cookie, they're adding to their cookie pile. But the first foray into addition for a second grader might be where they have something to manipulate and something to count and experience addition. Moving into then and mediating, okay, so now we're going to take that experience and we're going to label it. We're going to help you to see that, what these numbers mean and develop that conceptual understanding so that they can move to the procedural level and have it make sense, right? But then we would want them to be able to apply and make meaning of this with other experiences. So you may then give a problem that is meaningful and purposeful and helps them to develop the reason to add, right? Instead of seeing this as this discrete thing that we do at 10 o'clock in my classroom. We build that bridge for them. So I by no means am saying throw out all of the kinds of things that help kids, repeatedly practice. Not at all. What I am saying is we need a balance, and we need to realize that those things and experiences that come before this practice can be as powerful as any repetition. So hopefully that clarified. I'm glad that question came in because I wouldn't want people to think that you never repeat, because repeating is important. So I'm sorry. So these are the 4 different methods I'm going to share. There are lots and lots of different kinds of methods. These were the 4 that I chose that I felt were some of the best mediators, and also ways to formatively instruct and assess. And by that I mean being able to give feedback and get feedback, as well as gain information that helps guide instruction. So, and please interrupt me if there's another question along the way. So in English Language Arts, I'm going to show the use of cognitive markers. This would fall under a close reading strategy that I mentioned, and text-dependent questions. So this is a second grade piece of complex text. And it's pretty simple, couple paragraphs. So using cognitive markers or some kind of annotation, very active process, you might ask, and this is comes from Reading Informational Text number 2, Anchor Standard 2. Highlight. You might ask kids to highlight in different colors, different very specific information from the text. And so you would have really specific evidence of whether or not students were able to do this, because you have marks on the paper right away, or they do, right? Which is very helpful in terms of being able to give feedback or mediate. Another piece to this might be a text-dependent question. And what we mean by text-dependent questions are questions that require you to look back at the information in the text, right? So this comes from Reading Informational Text Anchor Standard 1. So here might be an answer to this text-dependent question, and another text-dependent question where it asks what the idea of literally returning to the text and getting information out of the text and finding evidence, etc., is a huge component of what Common Core is requiring of students. So this asks what specific line. So in a lot of Common Core, a lot of different strategies will have students be numbering the either paragraphs or lines of text so that they can really get into the analysis of it and be able to specifically say, in line 4 or what have you. So this is very different than perhaps filling out a crossword puzzle, I think. And after students would do these different processes, they'd meet with a learning partner and then talk in a little depth about who they think the audience is for this piece of text and why. So a very kind of cohesive sequence of hopefully you can see how that mediated or that helped to move through the different levels of cognition. So I wanted to share with you next a sample using social studies, something that might be a helpful method that many of you probably use already, many of you know about, Socratic seminar. So it's an old idea that's been around for a long time, and it's a goodie. So this kind of contextualizes it for you during a unit on immigration. After reading complex text, an article which gives us some reading informational text, more informational text, students are given time to support and develop research, a relevant question, and then come to a Socratic seminar equipped to discuss it. Now this is, this is a simple, brief statement on a slide, and I recognize for those of you who may be social science or English language arts teachers, this is an awful lot. This is days of preparation. Days and days of preparation, but the meat of it I wanted to share with you so that you could see how this relates to a very, very effective way of getting kids to talk and articulate and learn. So during a Socratic seminar, students, this gives kids an opportunity to do the things that we are needing kids to do with not just Common Core, but 21st century kinds of skills and attitude and knowledge. So in a Socratic seminar, kids are getting great practice articulating their thinking, which is quite a big leap in the Common Core English language arts. Listening and speaking anchor standards are quite a bit more in detail and in depth than many current listening and speaking standards. Not only do they get a chance to articulate their thoughts, they do some other things that are really helpful. You, as a teacher, are able, once again, to formatively assess beautifully during a moment like this, an event like this in your classroom, because you're able to listen and gain a lot of information about what kids know and can articulate. So once again, this gives a teacher the ability to give and get feedback, great feedback, but also information that can guide further instruction. So a sample for math class using CGI. Some of you might know about this. It stands for Cognitively Guided Instruction, and it comes out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it does just that. It helps students, it helps children move through the thinking in various different kinds of ways. So This might be, if I link it to our addition problem, a question a few minutes ago. So this is one way. This is a famous, the brownie problem. So brownies are inherently real world to most kids, lots of kids. So posing a question or a problem, a real world problem to solve to kids that they are going to have understanding about, most kids, and this could be any kind of thing that you eat. It doesn't have to be brownies, but most kids have knowledge of brownies or food and how you have to cut them and what happens when somebody gets a bigger brownie than you, et cetera. So we're really tapping in cognitive, in CGI, you tap into real world problems and application of math. So so it might begin with some kind of connection to a bake sale or something real world that you're solving, and you develop a meaningful context for it. So kids are actually going to figure out how much they might charge for these brownies, and in doing so, students are challenged to apply mathematical concepts. So once students are somewhat hooked by this kind of intriguing problem, then you bring in some questions that they want to be able to solve, right? Because it's real world. And so as you mediate, again, you start with maybe some easier questions, and kids can gain confidence. Then you can move into some tougher questions. So, you can use this for differentiation purposes, a what-if question, and have these posted or posed to different kids in different groups. You can be very creative about being able to use different levels of problems. And then finally, what probably the most important idea about CGI is students track their thinking, they explain, they articulate, and they problem solve together. So they're given each, they're put in small groups to solve problems. They're given a real world applicable scenario, and then they're asked to use numbers, words, graphs, tables, or other images to solve this problem. So given a poster paper or a large piece of paper, and then given time to work on it, learn from one another, articulate, and then explain the reasoning to the group. And I've seen this done in many, many classrooms, and it's not only highly engaging, it is extremely effective in keeping students persevering with throughout a problem. So these methods that I shared with you, these 4 different methods, help develop these rigorous thinking patterns, these patterns that we know our students are going to be challenged in life as well as in school, right? And they also help with some of the things that Common Core are asking. And probably most importantly, these kinds of methods help kids stay engaged in the problem at hand, but also in school. And that's really important. So where the methods that I've shared today apply attributes of effective teaching and learning that we've gotten from cognitive science, from neuroscience, et cetera. And this is a great phrase, quote that came from a presenter that I heard a few months ago. The brain becomes what it does. So in thinking about the different kinds of shifts we need to make in instruction, these kinds of challenging real-world kinds of problems we might be able to help kids solve will create a generation of kids that can, help our world become a better place. So in closing, I do want to leave some time for any questions, but in closing, I'm just going to show you a few slides that are more instructional methods that will help shifts in these different areas of Common Core. So, and as I said before, I know they're archiving this webinar, so you'll be able to come back to this if needed. So those are shifts in math. Shifts in science, I didn't speak too much about the next generation science assessments. Those are linked to the Common Core, but they are not part of what you see in Common Core. You have to go to a website, nextgenscience.org. And those just came out last week in their final form. And they are really interesting, different kinds of standards. One of the most interesting parts that I found was that there is not only the scientific method embedded in them, but also a heavy dose of engineering and design. So using design to solve problems, and a great deal of interdisciplinary kinds of ideas, how to have science be across the curriculum. And then methods to promote instructional shifts in social science. Anytime you can use things like simulations and case studies, Socratic seminar, etc., where students are able to articulate their thinking, it's going to be really helpful for kids. So ways we can help students get there, whether we're a teacher or a principal or a librarian or what have you, or parent, policymaker. These are some ways that come from my work in kind of translating neuroscience and cognitive science to educators. So these are 6 things that really help kids develop a lot of different cognitive flexibility. So get kids talking, get kids writing. Writing in the content areas and informational writing has been shown to be incredibly effective for helping kids organize their thinking. Get kids tracking. So get kids counting things and figuring out their progress and graphing how they're doing, and showing some, finding the results of, that challenging task they stuck to. That can be incredibly motivating for kids. Get kids thinking, using really good problems and formative instruction. Get kids making their thinking visible, so publicly displaying evidence of their thinking. And this is incredibly important. Writing on posters and keeping it up and having kids find evidence and posting the evidence publicly and talking about it and articulating it. And then finally, getting kids to solve worthwhile problems together that require application of these great standards and the great stuff that we're teaching kids. So in closing, these are my thoughts. I think that we can help mediate and modulate thinking patterns in our kids because of plasticity. And I'm sure that's a word that most of you are very familiar with. The brain can change, and it grows and changes through experience and events. And we as educators can absolutely engineer the environment with different resources, planning, experiences to help develop effective thinking patterns. The Common Core are, as you know and as you've seen, will require more rigorous thinking than we currently require in our standards. And finally, different kinds of things that we can use can act as a conduit for the shifts that are going to be required. So now is the time. I wanted to leave at least 10 minutes for any kinds of questions before signing off.
Margaret, we do have someone that has kind of made it basically as an observation and followed that with a question.
Sure.
That she sees many students that are capable of memorizing the math facts but aren't able to master it. And that she wondered what would be the best means to teach children math facts over flashcards. The parents are using flashcards for their children, and it doesn't seem to be really working very well. And other than, I mean, you kind of got at that with your brownie example, and I really think those examples that you had of getting the kids thinking. But is there some other insight you would like to add to that?
Sure. So I think to clarify the questions, how can you get that memorization down? Because we know we do sometimes need to just have things that are at the ready, aside from flashcards.
Right.
So a couple of things that I could suggest would be, because flashcards are fleeting, and they're also not necessarily a strong visual for some kinds of kids. So a couple different things that you could recommend for students, any kind of computer, kind of a game that kids could attach a strong visual to for math facts. The different charts, like the hundreds charts or multiplication charts with a visual, with an array that kids can attach that to. Then there's always, there are going to be kids who you teach them a song with math facts and they'll remember. So the different kinds of ways into, think of visual, think of the different senses that could help kids. So the visual could be those different things I mentioned, and the auditory could be some kind of song or chant, etc. If flashcards don't do it. And then, that the whole idea of repetition, again, is important too. So hopefully that. But I think one of the biggest things I've seen is when kids know that they need to have quick access to those math facts because they're doing something really engaging with it, that is when those kids will be motivated to stick with even, flashcards or what have you. So hopefully that.
What I used to do with my science students, my chemistry students, is I used to give them a mnemonic or something to help them remember, but then challenge them to create something else of their own that they could connect to. And a lot of times it was just a silly statement that they would all laugh to, but they never forgot it after that.
Absolutely, especially if it comes from them, and if it's, the other thing we know about memory, which is a whole other webinar, but the thing that we know about memory is the consequentiality of the information is what we remember often, as well as if it's very novel, if it's very humorous or funny, we will tend to remember that better than if it's neutral. So absolutely, I could see where that would work.
And there's another question: what do you do with children who have weaker cognitive skills and weaker processing speed, for whom getting to analyze and synthesize would be hard?
Absolutely, we all have different strengths and weaknesses there, and I think what's important to consider with kids who, and I appreciate how the question is worded, because yes, it can be hard for kids, harder for some kids than others to analyze something. I think going back to the idea of mediation and helping scaffold for those kids, one of the things that I would suggest, especially with kids who sometimes the longer they're in school, the more bad news they get, and it's like they're on a losing streak with certain things, and so sometimes you see them lose motivation and lose, maybe even become a little apathetic. So often starting where they are and starting with things that they can do successfully. Let's say they might not be able to analyze a complex text at grade level, but they might be able to analyze a photograph first very well and be very successful with this, and then transfer what they can do to a little harder, a little more challenging with your guidance and support as good teachers all do. So, I think that the simple answer to that, which is not simple at all, is providing a certain amount of scaffolding for those kids in ways that help them develop confidence.
And Margaret, for students who might have some real cognitive deficits, in attention skills or working memory or some things that obviously are going to be areas that are going to have more demands placed on them in the process of trying to reach these standards, is something like brainware and actually developing those skills a part of that kind of scaffolding?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we talked about in before the question about repetition, and we absolutely have things, important resources at our ready that we can use, and something like brainware that helps students develop those underpinning skills, cognitive skills that are required for things like analyzing text or things like multiplying. Seeing patterns, holding attention, all of those underpinning skills are so critical to so much, as you teachers and educators know. So when we can give kids access to that kind of practice, especially if it's consistent and fairly frequent, that can absolutely build those neural networks that then can help build all kinds of confidence, motivation, etc. So, yes, I wholeheartedly agree.
Great. Sarah, any other questions that you can see?
No, I think that probably covers them.
When folks are registering, we did have some very interesting questions. Some of them you've answered about where people can access information on the new Common Core standards, so I think that is very helpful. Somebody did ask, are there any ready-made resources to support teachers in the transition? You've given some wonderful examples, and I think that will help, but I don't think there's any sort of authoritative guide to how to do that. It's really work that has to, the teachers and in groups and within their communities and schools that really are going to require some quite a bit of thought, it seems like.
Yes, and that's a great question. There aren't any necessarily, there are no ready-made, there currently are no curriculum, made, especially for Common Core yet. And what I'm seeing across the nation is districts who are having teams of teachers create Common Core aligned curriculum, and they're starting with interdisciplinary units. And that's some of the work that I do, is help schools develop those kinds of things so that they can have not only a very tailored kind of curriculum, but also learn how to do this without necessarily having to rely on a publisher. So great question. Unfortunately, or fortunately, right now there's no one-stop shop for Common Core ready lessons and units.
Well, there are two sides to that sword, as always, and I know as I've worked, and I teach graduate level students from time to time, and as I've tried to incorporate more brain compatible, the kinds of strategies that you've shared here, that I learned so much more myself about my discipline and the topic and whatever it happens to be. So absolutely. I think that's a very positive aspect to it. Absolutely. As well for teachers.
Yes, I agree.
Well, any last thoughts? Any real words of wisdom for some of the folks out there who are just embarking on this journey of moving towards, people feel like they haven't really caught up with the old state standards, and now here's something new. What would be your suggestions for those folks?
Well, I guess I I think of it as an exciting time, and a time that we can really, I think, make a big difference for the kids in our country. And although it does, these shifts are going to be challenging for some, I think the results we will see will really compel us to continue our work. I see it as very positive. So I commend everybody for being in a webinar that's teaching you about common core in the brain. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Well, thank you, Margaret. I think you provided a wonderful ideas and information, and hopefully everybody will find it useful and helpful and take some things back to go think about and share with their colleagues.
I sure hope
so. Thank you for being here, and thank you everybody for attending. We look forward to seeing you at a next a neuroscience and education webinar in the future, and we hope you all have a great day.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.